I'm Nomi Joyrich, and I'm the Michigan Director for Jews for a Secular Democracy. Our Executive Director, Paul Golan, is with us today, too. And I'd like to introduce my good friend who I haven't seen in a long, long time, Rabbi Rob Moray. And we're so thankful to Temple Anshe Chesed for co-sponsoring this wonderful event. And I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Moray to introduce our speaker.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My pleasure to introduce Rabbi Steve Denker from Cleveland. Just by way of a little bit of background, most recently, Rabbi Denker was the interim rabbi at Temple Kolami in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And before that, retiring from Temple Emmanuel in Orange Village, Ohio, near Cleveland, where he served as a rabbi for 18 years. After his ordination in 1984, Rabbi Denker began his rabbinic career as an assistant and then associate rabbi at Chicago's Temple Shalom. And Rabbi Denker trained for the interim and transitional rabbinic service with the CCAR and Interfaith Ministries Network, and then took the position in West Bloomfield following his retirement. He has been an adjunct faculty member at a number of universities, including Kent State, Loyola, DePaul, and teaching courses in world religions, Judaism, and Hebrew Bible. He has served on several committees of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland and was co-chair of the Rabbi Evangelical Dialogue Group. A lifelong Zionist, Rabbi Denker is active in AIPAC and a member of AIPAC's Cleveland Council. He was born in New York City and graduated from Brooklyn Technical High School and has his BA from the City University of New York and a master's in Hebrew Letters and honorary Doctor of Divinity from Hebrew Union College. And Rabbi Denker is now currently a college student. Did I get that right? Yes. Pursuing an associate's degree in automotive technology. So that's awesome. We have to talk about cars sometime. We have a whole bunch of classic cars at our house. Rabbi Denker is married to Lisa, who is an attorney in private practice, and they have adult children. Rabbi Denker, thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to a great evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Moray.
I also forgot to mention that if at any point you have any questions, please write your questions in the chat, and I will be reading out all the questions throughout the evening. So please just feel free to put any questions in the chat. Rabbi Denker.
Thank you. Just so everyone understands, we've sent you the texts, which I hope you've either printed out or have available on the second screen. But just to make sure everybody's literally on the same page, as we go through, Paul is going to be posting them on the screen. He'll be screen sharing them, and then we'll bring them up and down as we go. Also, as Nomi said, please put your questions in the chat, and then either Paul or Nomi will be feeding the questions to me. They'll be able to consolidate them and so forth. We're going to be strict about our subject tonight, which is the announced subject. I'd like to start out the hour that we have together by talking about how Jews relate to government in general. We are obviously going to talk about church-state relations and stuff like that, but I want to talk about how Jews relate to government in general. And we're going to see that in a couple of the texts that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to flip back and forth. The first text that I want to refer to is one that's not in your packet, but one with which you may be familiar. I hope you are familiar, from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29:7 says, "V'darshu et shalom ha'ir asher higalti etchem shama v'hitpalalu ba'ad el Adonai ki bishloma yiyeh lechem shalom." The translation, for those who don't know the Hebrew yet, is Jeremiah and here's the context. Jeremiah is preaching to the Judean community that has been exiled to Babylonia. And they write back, presumably, or message back. I don't think they had email back to Jeremiah, who's back in Judea, or perhaps has already escaped to Egypt. We're not quite sure where he was physically sitting at that moment. but okay, now we're in exile here. What do we do? And Jeremiah's response, and what we just read was part of it, says, seek the shalom. In this context, I would translate shalom as welfare or well-being of the city to which I, God speaking through Jeremiah, have exiled you, and pray on behalf of the city to God, because, okay, the welfare of the city because your welfare depends on the welfare of the city. In other words, the well-being of the Jews is going to rise or fall depending on the well-being of the community in which they're living. And I think it's kind of obvious. I think we all know this. We know that when there's economic distress, it's worse for the Jews. So really, clearly, since the days of Jeremiah, we have in one way or another been dealing with how do we manage a Jewish community, or how does a Jewish community deal in a society that they are not governing, that somebody else is governing? Because the idea of secular democracy is not quite there yet. It's got a long way to go. Some would say it's still got a long way to go. But it's certainly, but that's not the issue for Jeremiah, but that is the context in which. So the recognition of the issue of a Jewish community existing as a minority or as a group within a larger group is certainly very much there. And for most of Jewish history, being Jewish or being anything other than what the state religion was represented some sort of a disability, whether it was out and out discrimination or whether it was limitations on what businesses you could go into or how many of you could live there. That's a story. There's some kind of limitation. That's a much deeper and much longer story, obviously. And if sometime we have a chance to talk about Rabbi Murray, I think I once spoke at your congregation about Eastern European Jewry and how it was governed. So that's a different conversation. So fast forward to America. I just skipped a couple of thousand years. Hope you'll excuse me. Let's fast forward to America. And now, Paul, if you would put up the page 1, and page 1, as you can see, is this George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. In case you're not familiar with this document, it's dated 1790, which was right after George became either the 9th or the 11th president of the United States, depending on how you count it. I go with him as the 9th president of the United States at that point. And Washington makes a progress throughout the newly minted states, and he's asked the question, and he gets a letter from the Newport congregation, as well as from other communities in America, including Muslims. And he's asked one way or another, okay, how are we going to fare in this new country that has just been established, especially since the idea that there was a government-sponsored religion, to use the words of the Constitution, an established religion, and that's what established religion means, that there is an official religion. All right, how are we Jews? And again, Muslims here had the same issue as well as others. And of course, in some states, you had a preference of one Protestant group or another. Maryland starts out being Catholic. So the question given to this new president of this newly constituted country, although he's the 9th president of the country in general, goes out. And Washington answers that, and in the case of Rhode Island, and as well as other places, he writes back this letter. And if Paul, if you could get us to the bolded part, the third paragraph, we're not going to read the whole thing. And George answers them The citizens of the United States, the bolding is mine. By the way, I tried to communicate with him and they asked if it was all right, but he never answered. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy. He means liberal now. We'll explain that in a minute. A policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. So what Washington is saying is that this new country, there will be an enlarged and liberal policy, and this is, again, it's Enlightenment stuff for sure, humanist stuff to a certain extent, definitely deism, which is what Washington and many of his cohorts were. They believed in God, but they didn't have a specific understanding of God that they subscribed to. These people read the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, the Quran. They took it all in and saw them all as being equal. And Washington is promising that this new country, everyone shall have liberty of conscience, which means, it's like a Gedankensinnfrei. You can think however you want. We're not going to control how you think. And then immunities of citizenship, meaning that if someone is a Jew or a Muslim or a Protestant of one kind or another, they will all have whatever immunities a citizen, or the rights, we could kind of turn that word around, the rights of citizenship. Their rights will not be diminished, curtailed, truncated, as was the case in other societies, even ones that were tolerant of minority groups. And he addresses that issue of toleration in the very next paragraph. It is now no more that toleration is spoke of as if it were an indulgence of one class of people, people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent rights. For happily will give no sanction to bigotry, persecution. That's the famous line that's always quoted as the second half of this paragraph. But the first line is important because what happened was toleration. You were in a Catholic country and you were a Protestant, the Catholics would decide if you were to be tolerated and to decide what rights you had, property rights and so forth and so on. So what Washington is clearly saying is that this ain't toleration. You don't have to worry to be tolerated or given a writ of settlement or something like that. You simply are a citizen just like everybody else. And then the second part of that paragraph, which is more famous than the first part of it, although I think wrongly. And one other thing before we talk about Washington, before we go on, I'd like to point out, Paul, if you could drop us down a paragraph or two, right there at the bottom of this paragraph. Washington, again, who knew the Bible, it says, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants. In other words, these guys are going to live peaceably among each other. And then he goes on to quote Micah or Isaiah. This line shows up twice in the Bible, one in Isaiah, one in Micah. I don't know which one he was looking at. While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Right? Those of you who grew up in summer camps, know that song. And this is kind of the image of the peaceable kingdom, if you will. Certainly, that's what we get. That everybody's going to let everybody, as gentleman Jimmy Walker is thought to have said, based on the Broadway musical, "Live and let live." Right, for those of you who are familiar with Fiorello, with the musical, live and let live. Everybody, nobody's going to attack anybody. Certainly not on the matter of religion. All right, so let me just pause for a second. Naomi, Paul, are there any questions on this text? Thank you.
There are no questions.
Okay.
Does anyone have a question? Okay, at this point, no questions.
Okay, so let's fast forward to page 2. The page 2 quotes this, by the way, this article, which we're not going to read the whole article together tonight. This article is actually off the website of the United States Congress. It's the United States Congress's website description and history of the First Amendment. So just so that you know where it comes from. And we all know the First Amendment. That's what this is all about. But let's go over it for a moment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. In this 18th century context, establishment of religion means exactly what I said earlier, which is that you have a government-sponsored, sanctioned religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay, plenty of court cases right there. And then we go on to the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so forth. But it's really only the first one. Now, what's interesting is that what this first sentence, this first phrase in the First Amendment means has constantly been a matter of debate. And as we know, it is still a matter of debate. It's a matter of debate when it comes to abortion rights, which certainly played in here in Ohio, played big in our election day earlier this week. It's a matter of funding, and we're going to refer back to some of that. It's a matter of government sponsoring, yea, verily, possibly requiring a religion. Now, lest you think that this issue was dropped from a governmental point of view, if you'll go down, Paul, please, to the next bolded section, which is at the bottom of the penultimate paragraph of the page, right? However, the state's constitution, this is the state of Maryland, continued to require office holders to declare a general belief in the existence of God, as opposed to a Christian belief in the existence of God, until 1961, when it was ultimately ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And if you look at the paragraph, we're not going to read it together tonight, but if you look at the paragraph or look up the website for the United States Congress, you can see the history and the very modeled history of what this meant. There are also some issues. Can the government hire a chaplain? Can the government provide for prayer for people who are locked up in a prison? Do we have prayer in the Congress? Which we do. And so this is a very, very interesting factor that even requiring Christian belief and then later requiring just belief in God to serve as a member of an office holder, an elected office holder of the state of Maryland, that did not go away until 1961, which, had I known before I was 10 years old, I would have, taken advantage of. So look at the rest of this article on your own, but let's just set it up that way. The next page on page 3 talks about the debate over the separation of church and state. For example, an 1811 bill would have incorporated, i.e. established, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the District of Columbia. President Madison vetoed the bill. And then a little bit further down, those of you who know the Marine Corps anthem, right? Page 1797, the shores of Tripoli, we had to assure the Muslim state of Tripoli that the United States was not in any sense founded on, not necessarily Christian. So the government itself, granted in the context of a war, or military action, I should say, is assuring a Muslim country that we're not a Christian country. But of course, we've gone back and forth on that, and we've had many instances where members of Congress have introduced legislation saying that the United States was a Christian country, and certainly we were hearing more of that than we did. As you can see in the last paragraph of that section. Questions? Quick stop for questions. I've either put you all to sleep or no, or I'm doing a great job. All right.
Well, I have one, but you can save it for later. But obviously, everything you're saying seems so clear cut to me, and we're supportive of it. How is it that so many Americans would say we are indeed a Christian nation?
All right. So let me answer, Paul. That's a great question. It seems clear cut to you and I, but it does not seem clear cut to everybody. If I drive eastward into 20 minutes from my home, and we're east of Cleveland, if I drive 20 minutes into the next county, I am quickly reminded that not everybody thinks the way we do. All right, and so I think one of the things that those of us who believe in the separation of church and state have to understand is that we, especially us in the Jewish community, obviously there are people who believe in separation churches beyond the Jewish community, thank God, but there are other people who have worldviews that are very, very different than those of us who are Jewish in urban areas, live in a generally, liberal with the small L kind of context. And some of them have a legitimate point of view. We don't agree with them. They're not necessarily bad people. Look, we got our own bad people, right? I mean, not necessarily bad people, but they really believe that the way to go is by enforcing religious law on everybody else. They might not even think of it as enforcing religious law. If I want to get diverted early on in the game, which I certainly, those who've studied with me before know that, we teach by diversion. Do you guys know me? Paul, do you mind if I go off track here a little bit?
Yeah.
All right. Take the abortion debate. Right. I think those of us who in our group, let's just do it that way, we don't understand that there are people out there, good, legitimate, moral people, who really believe that abortion is murder. They believe it in their heart of hearts, right? They believe it just as surely as those of us in this group believe in or follow or attach to Judaism one way or another. And it's important for us to recognize that. I had a case in Chicago for about 20 years. I was part of a group of rabbis and Catholic priests that met together. Every year we would go away for several days. It's some very interesting and sometimes difficult conversations. There was an auxiliary bishop in Chicago who was one of the world's experts in canon law. And the question of abortion came up. Right? This is rabbis of all stripes and Catholic priests. And it really came out, that we really didn't understand where the other ones were coming from. So we agreed that the next meeting, which was a year later, that Bishop Goddard, Alav Shalom, and this Jew were going to explain our religious positions on abortion. At the end of it, the bishop said he came to understand that Jews were not just in favor of abortion. I mean, because from his point of view, abortion was murder. And he said, look, don't you want a law against somebody standing on the street and, firing a gun at people? But we're not going to get into the gun discussion tonight. All right? This was 20 plus years ago. We didn't have the issue we have now. But and he said, if I believe that abortion is murder, then I have a moral responsibility to stop it. Without getting into the whole lecture on theology of abortion, if you do believe abortion is murder, then that's a legitimate position. Even if you're generally in favor of the separation of church and state. Now, as Jews, we don't believe abortion is murder. I'm not going to get into a lecture on halacha of abortion. I can at another time. We don't believe that. Muslims don't believe it. Buddhists don't believe it. Hindus don't believe it. Lots of people don't believe it. Lots of Christians don't believe it. So the separation of church-state question is vital to the abortion debate, right? Because what, as Jews, we want to do is keep Christian law off the books, as it were. So if somebody comes to me as a rabbi, I can advise them as a rabbi. Somebody comes to somebody as a Catholic priest, that Catholic priest can advise them as a Catholic priest. They are free to make their choice. But if you believe that abortion is murder, and you're riled up by certain political elements, and I'm not going to get into the political discussion, the idea that it's being used for electoral purposes, that's another whole piece I'm going to discipline myself to stay away from. That means that we have to understand that there are people who really believe differently than we do. I have a colleague in Chicago, a Hasidic rabbi. I don't know if he's really Lubavitch or not, whatever he was. And he drafted up, or had somebody draft up, an abortion law for the state of Illinois that basically followed halacha, right? Which by me is fine for me, for my congregants, for my loved ones. But I kind of said to him, I said, friend, do you really think the pig farmers in downstate Illinois care about halacha very much? Obviously, the proposal went no place. I think he got some member of the legislature to, introduce it. But that's the kind of thing we have to keep in mind. There are other people who really don't believe the same way we do.
I appreciate that perspective. Thank you. And there is a question in the chat now from Joyce, and I think this is perhaps more on track. But the stuff we've read so far, it seems like that was a pretty radical departure from what every other country has ever really had. So she asked, why did the U.S. end up acting differently from other countries on church-state separation questions? And did it have to do with the religious persecution of people who came here originally?
I think it does. I think the fact that you had people that you were dealing, first of all, we're at the end of the 18th century. The American Revolution and the French Revolution following it were really, and the British changes that are happening at about the same time, even though they didn't have a revolution then, really were the breakthrough from the Enlightenment. It's Enlightenment, it's not Renaissance anymore, but it's Enlightenment period, science on the ascendancy and that kind of thing. I mean, the stuff that we're talking about, again, if I think back to the plague, the recent plague, by that I call it the plague. If we think back at it, all right, notice how the same people who opposed masks and vaccinations and stuff like that were also the people who in other areas rejected science. Recent creationism, dinosaurs are a myth. I mean, that kind of stuff. Those two things, not 100%, of course, but those two positions kind of went together. They correlated. So what we're seeing now really is kind of a rejection of science and a rejection of the humanism that was first used, that was first became part of the government in America. I point out all the time, this is the first country in the world outside of Israel, outside of a sovereign state. This is the first country in the world where Jews really, at least on paper, had freedom of religion. That was new and different. Every place else, even in places where Jews were doing very well in the 18th and 19th century, and there were such places, and there are such places, even in those places, there was some restriction. There was some restriction. Disraeli's father had to become an Episcopal, had to become Church of England, because he felt that would be better for his family's success. What he actually believed, what his son Benjamin actually believed, I don't know. It's kind of interesting to look at some of Disraeli's stuff, because there are some very interesting hints there, about what he felt about himself, although nobody really knows for sure. But that's what you had to do, because there were disabilities. And then, of course, the problem with disabilities, the problem with just, let me use Washington's words, all right? The problem with just tolerance is that tolerance could be revoked. Whereas if you've got the full immunities of citizenship, it can't be revoked. At least it shouldn't be revoked. We've seen cases where citizenship was revoked, right? Nazi Germany. The Jews were allowed to become citizens of Germany in the 1880s. 50 years later, Hitler revoked it. Or he got it revoked. So that's the difference, but it's all tied in with Enlightenment. It's all tied in with all that stuff. But then the history of the First Amendment, and look at the rest of the article, and the cases and the political issues which this group is quite familiar, I am sure. The history there then shows that even though we said it, even though we put it in the Constitution, even though it's certainly what Washington and his comrades were thinking, the actualization of that now, 200 plus years later, is still problematic.
Here's a question and a comment. First, the comment from Liliana is that Napoleon gave Jews freedom of religion as well as citizenship.
Right.
And Marilyn asks, which church? Each state had its own religion.
Well, I mean, Rhode Island was the only one that had absolute freedom of religion, and therefore every crackpot in the colonies went to Rhode Island. And it was small; it still is. Different states had different. I mean, they're different religions, and I don't recall the exact list. I mean, Maryland is Catholic. That's why you've got Georgetown there. Maryland is Catholic, and the others, it depended on what they were. A lot of them were what then was called deists. Today we call them Unitarians. The Unitarian Church is a descendant of the deists. Believed in God, believed that there was one God, but did not define God very carefully, or that's the wrong word. They didn't define God very closely, and one could approach God in however you wanted.
Marilyn wants to clarify, she meant that there could not be a federal religion.
Right. Well, that was a question. I mean, I'm sorry. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, that was the question. I mean, the question, of course, was whether or not the amendment, as the case with, I'm not a lawyer, but as is the case, was the case with many provisions of the United States Constitution, was whether those provisions applied to the states as well. I mean, that's a whole world of constitutional law. Does the whole civil rights movement? The question is, you can have other states obligated, and we're having that discussion, that debate is tied up in the church-state debate as well. If there's a lawyer on who wants to comment on it, they should. Well, Naomi, you're a lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer.
I thought you were a lawyer. Somebody
I
ought
was
to
a
be.
lawyer, really? No.
Somebody ought to be a lawyer.
All right.
All right, are we ready for the next text? All right. If you'll go on page 3 to the Pirkei Avos. All right. Now we'll get to the Jewish part of this. We have this statement in the Mishnah. Some of you are familiar with Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Hanina, the vice high priest, not quite sure what that meant, said, right, and this sounds a lot like the Jeremiah, pray for the welfare of the Malchut, the kingdom. Literally, we translate it as the government. She'il male mora'a, right? Because if it was not for the fear that the government inspires, ish et re'ehu chayim bal'o. Each person would swallow each other alive. So there's a recognition, even in the Roman period, because remember the Mishnah is 220 or earlier, there's a recognition even in the earliest periods that government and Malchut, generally in rabbinic law, in rabbinic texts, Malchut generally refers to the non-Jewish overarching government, right? As opposed to the government. I mean, in modern Hebrew, we use a different word for government, but Malchut means the kingdom, the kingship. So it refers almost exclusively to the overarching government. That you need it, otherwise people would eat each other alive. There's a general recognition for the need of governance. And that then raises the question, okay, if there is a need for a government, whether it is a government with an established religion or not, either way, how do we relate to that government? And a significant part of that answer is found in the bit of Talmud that is immediately below. You've got the Hebrew on this page and the English on the next page. All right, just so that you know, this is off the Sepharia, and the bold type is what's actually in the Aramaic. The rest of it is filled in so that you can understand what's going on with the Aramaic. But if you will drop down to the end of that text, Paul, please, that's perfect. All right, if you drop down to the end of the text after there, all right, so what, and then I'm going to back up. The bottom line, literally, is the expression Dina de Malchuta Dina. That's Aramaic, that the din, the law of the Malchut, of the overarching non-Jewish government, is the law, is the law. This is one of the places where it's kind of enunciated in the Talmud. We see it all over halachic literature in all periods, and it is still an important active halachic issue. Now, if you look at the text that precedes it, which we're not going to take time to read together tonight, it is a text over business law. It is a text that deals with when do we know that a sale is a sale or a gift is a gift. And it has to do with whether or not a sale was approved of, and it uses the term court, but it doesn't mean a court like a trial court. It means court here means whatever the government authority is. If it's approved by the government, whatever mechanism, then the rabbis are saying then it is a valid sale under Jewish law as well. The way the principle ultimately operates is that, and the way it operates today, is that a Jew is expected to follow the law, the Jewish law, and the secular law, right? Whichever is more restrictive. Whichever is more restrictive. And that in cases where we're required to do something according to the secular law, as long as it's fair and equally applied, then we have to follow it as well. Let me give you an example. And again, when I'm using the term Jewish law here, I mean business law, criminal law, real estate law, that sort of stuff. I'm not talking about, most of us in the modern world, since modernity, when we think of Jewish law, we think of, what time do you have to light Shabbos candles? Is it kosher or not? Is it whatever? That's a modern problem. Prior to the modern world, prior to Jews being emancipated and allowed to be citizens, because somebody mentioned Napoleon earlier, right? The deal that the Jews made with Napoleon was that they would follow the civil law on non-ritual matters. Marriage, property rights, that kind of stuff, right? And that's really where the split touched. The exchange was they were allowed to be French citizens, and the Jews loved them for it. But what this is, so when we say Jewish law, we think of, when the Shabbos is kosher, that kind of business. But this really means everything else. So, for example, there's a debate going on, or there has been a debate going on. I don't know if it's going on currently. It's not something I follow very closely, as to whether or not blood sausages could be imported to the United States. I don't know how many are familiar with this butchery problem. And for a long time, the importation or even the sale of blood sausages, or what's also called black pudding, which is made primarily with the blood of an animal, was banned in the United States. So if it was banned, even though it was the consumption of blood, Jews shouldn't do it. For example, if they outlawed chickens, Jews shouldn't eat chickens, because we're supposed to follow what's the more restricted. If blood sausage was permitted, we still couldn't eat it, because we have Jewish law, kashrus law, that says we're not supposed to eat blood. So that's how Dina de Malchuta Dina works. Again, a lot more easily said than done, because what happens in the case where Jewish law and secular law butt up against each other? If abortion were banned, then we would have a real problem, because Jewish people who follow Jewish tradition, would not be able to exercise their religion when it came, God forbid, to a matter of life and death with regard to somebody possibly needing an abortion. Incidentally, while we're on the subject, partial birth abortion is actually described in the Mishnah. It's actually described in the Mishnah. So we know. So that's how Dina de Malchuta Dina works. You can continue, please, to the end of that page. Now we're going to skip back to the secular
Rabbi, in what way, which also I want to point out that partial birth abortion is a political term and not a medical term. There's no actual procedure called that. But in what way is that?
The Mishnah describes a procedure where that in the case of a delivery that is threatening the life of the mother, the fetus can be dismembered. Not only could be, but should be.
Thank you.
Right? It's very graphic. It's very, very, very clearly there. I mean, we can do a discussion about abortion another time. 1963, Abington School District versus Shemp. How many of you were in school in 1963? I was in grade school in 1963. All right? Those of us of a certain age who were in public schools in America remember, perhaps, about, reading the Lord's Prayer before assembly, reading a quote from the Bible, when they came over the loudspeaker before the principal made his or her announcements for the day. Prayer, reading from the Bible, usually the Christian Bible, was a regular part of public school activities. And then in 1963, it abruptly stopped. I was 11, 12 years old. And I remember a teacher getting up, teacher I really loved, getting up and saying, we're not reading the Bible anymore in assembly. It was over. I don't think any of us understood the implications of it, but it was a public school, and that's what happened. Right? And then after that, about 10 years later, there's a whole lot of cases around this stuff. That was the case that knocked out prayer in the public schools. And then what lawyers call the lemon test. This does not have to do with an automobile, although again I can talk to you about lemons and cars in a different context. It's not the fruit, but the case was Lemon versus Kurtzman. It was argued in 71 and in 73 that in order to have a restriction on a government laws, federal law must have a secular purpose, not just a religious purpose. It must neither advance nor inhibit religion, and it cannot foster excessive government entangled with religion. Number 3 is where we get all of our problems. And while many of us think of that as simply a church problem or a problem with the Christian church, I got to tell you, this is an issue with the Jewish community as well. Jewish day schools apply for government grants, just like everybody else does. Jewish day schools apply for it. At what point can the grants be done? In New York State, at one point, they allowed the government to purchase secular textbooks for parochial schools, but obviously that was, those all those kind of things, and there's slews of cases even to this day, and a lot of it now revolves around this. The question for us, and again, I'm not a lawyer, the question for us is, will lemon go the way that some of the other things have gone, given the nature of the Supreme Court and the federal courts these days? I think that's part of the danger, because it does affect Jewish institutions as well. And we have what could be an interesting situation now. We in the Jewish community, we've been looking towards the government for help with security arrangements. I've been doing it for a long time. My former congregation, the congregation from which I retired, got a lot of money to keep us safe while we were in the building, to keep our preschoolers safe while they were in the building. Was that a government involvement in religion? Yeah, but does the government also have an interest in making sure that the kids in our preschool, the 2- and 3-year-olds, were not hurt? Yeah, we had that too. So, I mean, these are not easy questions to answer. Did I get up on my hind legs and say we can't take this government money because we're a religious institution? No, and I'm big on separation of church and state. I did not object. We took the money, we used it. It's not easy. There are other, I think, more subtle ways where this becomes an issue that most people just don't talk about. Which is, more subtle ways that people just don't talk about. I mean, we have lots of Jewish organizations that are dependent on government money, services to the elderly, nursing homes, housing projects, that kind of thing. I mean, drawing that line is very hard. And from a Jewish perspective, we have to ask the question, if 90% of your budget comes from government money, then are you a Jewish organization or just a government contractor? So it's important to look at this kind of issue not only from the, from the secular government side, but also from the Jewish side. You quite ask what that's doing to the Jewish community as well. Let me stop here and see if we have any questions. I don't know how our time is doing. Do we have any questions?
It's 8:25, and there are no other questions.
All right, so it's like I said, either I put everybody to sleep or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
All right, the last page of the packet, just two things that I want to refer to. So we've got two, situations. The one at the bottom of the page, let me do that one first. I mean, here's a case where a little congregation in Miami Beach, okay, got $1.3 million from the city of Miami Beach, because they were discriminated against because of their use of the building, right? This is the question. They got around it somehow, right? Building codes and things like that apply to all buildings. But what happens when a religious institution violates the building codes, right? Now, in this case, the congregation was able to say that they were treated differently than all other organizations in the community. So that's discrimination. If they're treating you the same as everybody else, that's one thing. But in this case, they were pointed out, they were focused on, and therefore they won their claim that they were discriminated against. But this happens. I mean, you have it. When we built I was blessed with the opportunity to help rebuild build a new building for our congregation here in Cleveland. And, when I talked working with the architects, I said, do not get me within an inch of the sideline requirements or the height requirements. A relative of ours came to see the building while it was under construction. He said, Steve, why didn't you make it bigger? I said, because I didn't want to deal with having to come up against the local zoning laws and have to look for a variance. I told the architects, do not put me within an inch of a variance. All right, I've got to do everything according to the book. So that juxtaposition between the functioning of the Jewish community, something. And if you go to the top one, back up to the top one, which is the last text that I'm going to refer to. This is an ongoing case. This is a live issue. I was trying to update this by finding out where this is in the courts, if it's in the courts yet, and I couldn't find it. Somebody else may know. But this just came up last June, where the state of Oklahoma, which has a board that funds virtual charter schools, not just charter schools, virtual, they voted in favor of funding a church-sponsored, a clearly church-sponsored religious charter online school. And this is now working its way through the systems. So you can see this is a very, again, regardless of what George said, that George Washington, and that is whatever, regardless of the other things, this debate and this discussion is still very, very much with us. So I hope this was enlightening, gave you a little background, a little understanding of where we're at, not only from the secular point of view, but also from the Jewish and the Jewish community's point of view. And are there questions?
No, there aren't. Does anybody have any questions that they have not yet put in the chat?
Okay, everybody's cars are running well.
Rick has a question. You want to just unmute, Rick?
Yeah, I'd heard that the Lemon test was overturned by the Supreme Court decision on Bremerton versus Washington.
Yes, it was.
Approach to lead prayer in the middle of the football field.
I don't know if it was out and out overturned, but it certainly was whittled away at. I'd want to get a lawyer to answer whether it was chiseled away at or overturned. I would ask a lawyer that question.
Okay.
I don't think it was wholesale overturned, not like Roe v. Wade.
Thank you.
But I think chiseled away is a good phrase, and I also think you really gave a helpful kind of explanation about like that gray area, right? Many religious organizations serve as soup kitchens, for example. Sometimes, though, they have tried to proselytize while they're giving out the soup, right? So then they cross that line. So there is this gray line. They get government money to run the soup kitchen, I mean. And then they all. So one of the questions I'm thinking about is that, you know, Judaism is not, for the most part, or hasn't been in 2,000 years, a proselytizing religion. Like, we're not missionaries trying to convert other people, but there are religions that see that as their mission, in the same way that you were describing, trying to understand people who genuinely believe abortion is murder. So I'm wondering, like, how might, if there's a way to counter that in the context of church-state separation. And also, just I wanted clarification on that story. Did the Catholic priests in that conversation with you, did they also begin to better understand the perspective that abortion is not murder, in the way that you were able to empathize with their view of it?
No.
Okay.
Well, look, I mean, I don't know what everyone, I mean, there were about 50 of us in the room, so I don't know. I don't know if I changed anybody's mind. I mean, it was not a meant, I mean, the nature of that dialogue, which was a wonderful and very important dialogue, was not to try to sell anybody. I mean, what we were trying to do was to understand each other, which I think we made a lot of progress in that, at least on the part of the members of the clergy who were there. No, it wasn't a question of you know, I'm going to convince you that abortion is not murder. It was a question of trying to help the Jews understand the Catholic position, and help and trying to help them understand the Jewish position, which, at least from what Bishop Goddard said, you know, I guess it helped him because he said so. Whether it helped everybody else in the room, I couldn't tell you what was going on in their heart of hearts.
But that pushing of the gray area is an agenda, though, that we're trying to counter, because it's not just coincidental that they're chipping away. I mean, this is part of the plan. And one of the things I thought was interesting also, when you brought up like the ruling in 1963, it was only, I think it was 1954 when the national motto was changed, right? From E pluribus unum to In God We Trust, right? And that was, of course,
and that was under the influence of the evangelicals.
Right.
They're not nearly politically powerful then as they are now.
But now it is our national motto, and it's on our money. And more importantly, it's one of those items where, because it's settled law, they can use it to chip away. And so, for example, laws in Texas that now every public school has to have our quote unquote national motto over their doors or whatever in the classrooms. And you know, so there's an agenda behind that kind of gray area chipping away.
Yeah,
Rabbi,
and look, I think it's fair to say that I'm making that comment from a political point of view, not from a legal point of view. That, you know, stuff like Dodd and these, I mean, these aren't, you know, momentary occurrences. These are cases in our system. You know, cases build up, the precedents. You know, it's a slow process in both directions. And you know, we didn't get to the lemon thing, you know, until 1970s to the 1970s. So you know, go from, you know, the First Amendment to that, it's a long time.
Rabbi Malcolm asks, he says, there's the question of whether religious law can override secular law. Can you please address that?
I mean, again, from a Jewish point of view, the principle of dina de malchut dina, and I just showed you the term in one case, but there's a lot of halacha on that. You know, if the government asks you to do something that's against your religion, you know, the government can't force me to eat pork. I observe the more restrictive. We do have, I mean, in American law, we have the idea of a conscientious objector or something like that. You know, the best case, the real practical case situation was the blue laws. The blue laws were an interesting thing because everybody know what I'm talking about?
No,
Yes.
What?
no, go ahead and explain, please.
Okay, the blue laws were laws in many states and jurisdictions that you had to be closed on Sunday, unless you were in New York, where I grew up. It had to be closed on Sunday unless you were selling food, and the bars couldn't be open until after church was over or something. Okay, those were the blue laws. Those are the laws that made people like my grandparents, okay, have to keep their stores open on Saturday, because if they didn't, they would starve, because that's when the neighborhood was out shopping. And again, and that influenced a lot of conservative and reform congregations, and it influenced certainly the reform movements, inventing the big Friday night service. That may seem like a matter of course to all of you, right? But the fact that Jews had to work on Saturday did a Friday night service. And everybody familiar with Lady Lily Montagu? She was a British lady, Jewish woman, very wealthy, and she's established a synagogue in West London that I think still exists. A synagogue in West London, the congregation still exists, I believe, where they read Torah they read the morning's Torah portion on Saturday afternoon. They had a service on Saturday afternoon where they read Torah for the morning, and those of you familiar know that the Torah portion of the week changes at noon on Saturday. So, but they would read it. Why did she do that? She did that because the practice was that the shop girls, I'm not being sexist, that's what they were called, all right, that the shop girls were required to work on Saturday a half a day. And when the half day was over on Saturday, they were then required to deliver the dresses or the garments to the rich patrons who generally lived in West London. So Lady Montagu established a synagogue in West London that met on Saturday afternoon so that the Jewish shop girls could go to shul after they finished their workday. Right. So this is so we had blue laws in the United States. There were and there was a movement initially in New York. It was led by Rabbi Teitz, alav shalom, who was actually my first rabbi when I was a kid. His brother was the founder of the Lakewood Yeshiva, and to change the law in New York State. The New York State law was changed so that you had to be closed one day a week, but you could choose which day. And then ultimately the Supreme Court knocked out the blue laws altogether, and unless it's by custom or by agreement of trade associations, you've got stores open on Saturday. But that was blue laws, and I don't remember why I was talking about blue laws. It's about chipping away at things.
Well, we're talking about secular law and religious
Oh,
law.
right, secular and religious law. Thank you. But that's why people like my grandparents, both sets, they had to obey the law. They couldn't, like one couldn't sell ladies' coats and suits, and the other one couldn't sell shoes, on Sunday. So they had to be open on Saturday.
Rabbi, I know you told me that this was late for you,
Yes.
and you made me promise you that we would end on time.
All right, so I didn't make you.
So I
broke it for you.
I want to thank Rabbi Moray. I want to thank the temple for co-sponsoring, and I really want to thank Rabbi Denker, who, as I said, I miss dearly. He used to be at my temple. And thank you so much for everybody who came. I hope this was informative and enlightening, and I will be sending out the recording in a few days after it gets downloaded. So and another copy of the readings. And thank you so much, Rabbi Denker, and I hope you come visit us soon.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank Paul for running the screens and for managing the the production end of it.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
very
It was
much.
excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.